Welcome to the first of two lectures on kinship. In this first lecture, we'll cover some basics and begin exploring how kinship is made in different cultural contexts. In the next lecture, we'll continue that discussion and then focus a bit more on how kinship is working in our society now. Kinship governs the relationships between reproduction and social belonging. Some things to note about kinship. It consists of categories, relationships, and practices that are based upon not just facts of biology, but also culturally determined beliefs and values concerning human biology and reproduction. We've talked about that a bit. Certain elements of kinship, because of biology, are very widespread, if not universal. The mother-child bond, though as we will see, there are cases where even this can be attenuated, is an example. And this is related to the fact that humans have a lengthy infant nurturing period. The marital bond also seems nearly universal, though as we will see, marriage can take on many different forms in different places. Another universal is the incest prohibition, though who it covers varies from culture to culture. For the discussion prompt for this topic, I asked you to make a list of your kin and think about how you decided who was in and who was out. I've compiled the most common responses here. You might have noticed as you did this that kinship is established in a number of different ways. First, there are blood relatives. Then there are those kin we are related to by marriage. Then there's a third category that includes people and sometimes animals who we feel a kinship toward but are not quote unquote real relatives. And in fact, anthropologists have found that kinship is established in three different ways. The first is by what we typically call blood. This is the culturally determined notion that there's some sort of shared biological link between people of different generations. The technical term here is descent. This link can also exist between people with a common ancestor or set of ancestors. This is called consanguinity, which is a mouthful, which basically means shared blood. Kinship can be created by marriage, which creates alliances between people. Cultural definitions of the marriage bond and associated cultural constructs allow offspring to belong to different parents, so to speak, and to establish links of responsibility and loyalty among parents and children and different levels of kin. Anthropologists call the relationships established by marriage affinity, and kin linked by marriage affinal kin. Kinship can also be made by the sharing of resources of different kinds, financial, material, emotional, etc., between people who aren't related by blood or marriage. The sharing of resources creates relationships of mutual support and obligation. This establishes what anthropologists call fictive kinship. Some classic examples of this are godparents, close friends of your parents who you consider your uncle or aunt, and so on. In this lecture, we'll cover kinship made by descent and marriage. In the next lecture, we'll talk about fictive kinship. Given the variety of ways in which kinship is made, it's a bit difficult to reach a simple definition of kinship. But here's a rough one. Kinship is a series of claims on the loyalty and resources of others that is often, but not always, rooted in biological links. Thus, kinship creates a special sense of belonging, but the basis for this can vary. Beyond this issue of defining what kinship is, we want to think about what kinship does. As stated, kinship creates claims on people and resources. Kin are different from non-kin, right? You owe them more. They owe you. Kinship also creates a powerful sense of belonging within a group. Finally, it creates prohibitions and obligations, particularly in regard to sex and marriage. Kinship delimits who you can or cannot marry, who you can or cannot have a sexual relationship with, who you can or cannot have children with. Another point, we want to focus on the different ways in which kinship is made or constructed, both within our culture and across cultures. Kinship is not automatic. It has to be created and recreated if it is to be culturally meaningful. A couple of other points. Kinship is flexible and can be manipulated. People are aware that it creates claims and may try to take advantage of that or guard against it. Related to this is the fact that kinship has to be understood in the broad cultural context. As that context changes, kinship changes too. As we will see, this is true even of descent, which we typically think of as the strongest kinship bond of all. Thus the phrase, blood is thicker than water. In the rest of this lecture, we'll discuss the three ways, descent, marriage, and the sharing of resources, that establish kinship. First, let's turn to descent. Descent is a cultural construction of the biological link between generations and between people descended from a common ancestor. It serves as the basis for the distribution of resources and for mutual obligations. Different societies trace descent in different ways. Most common here is unilineal kinship, meaning descent is traced through one specific parent, either the mother or the father. Cognatic kinship is essentially kinship traced through both the mother and the father. About 60% of societies in the world today are unilineal, and about 40% are cognatic. But this is the kinship pattern most common in the United States. If descent is traced through the father, it is known as patrilineal descent. The kin established through patrilineal descent are known as agnatic relatives. The tribes of Israel, described in the Bible, are an example of a patrilineal society, as are the Dogon, who we discussed earlier. Most unilineal societies are patrilineal. Here's a diagram of how this works. Note that in these kinds of kinship diagrams, kinship is always reckoned from the point of view of a certain person. In these diagrams, that person is labeled as ego. Gender is indicated by a circle for female or a triangle for male. Only the people represented by colored shapes are considered kin under the kinship system depicted. The others are either not considered kin at all or considered distant kin, the way we might consider a third or a fourth cousin. So, this shows the people who count as kin in a patrilineal society. They are the kin traced through the father's sister, the father's brother, the father's father, and so on. In patrilineal societies, there tends to be a closer relationship between father and children, and a lot of investment of time and resources by fathers in their children. As we have noted, this makes the issue of paternity very important. If descent is traced through the mother, it's known as matrilineal descent. The kin established through matrilineal descent are known as uterine relatives. While matrilineal societies are relatively rare, there are still many examples. One famous example are the Ashanti kingdoms of West Africa. Again, here's a diagram that shows uterine relatives in green. You'll note it includes the mother, the mother's brother, the mother's grandmother, and so on. In these kinds of societies, the father tends to take a less prominent role in children's lives. Often the mother's brother is a very important male figure for kids and takes on some of the responsibilities we typically associate with fatherhood. Less common than unilineal kinship is cognatic kinship, which can be traced through the mother, the father, or more commonly, is traced through both. In most places in the United States and Western Europe, kinship is cognatic. More specifically, it is bilateral, meaning that it is traced through both the mother and the father. Ambilineal kinship is another kind of cognatic kinship, whereby different people trace their kinship through different parents. It might be the mother, it might be the father, depending. Cognatic kinship has certain effects and fits into society in a certain kind of way. It creates broad but shallow kin groups, meaning your kinship lineage in cognatic societies tends to not go very far into the past, but it does include a lot of people right now. This lack of depth tends to make kin groups more fragile, but also more flexible. Your kinship may not go as deep into the past, but it can include different kinds of people in the present. This kind of kinship makes sense given our society, which is very mobile and dynamic, whereas other forms of kinship might make sense for societies that have different characteristics. Thus, again, kinship often reflects the broader cultural context of which it is a part. Parenthood is the fundamental unit of descent. Humans must invest heavily in their offspring, as infants have a long nurturing period. We assume that parenthood automatically creates a bond between parent and child. We especially assume this in the case of mothers. But in the case of both fathers and mothers, this is not necessarily the case. Variables here that might affect this include the kinship structure in general. For example, patrilineal kinship makes the father-child relationship important in a way it may not be in matrilineal kinship. The economic situation matters as well. There are situations in which economics makes it irrational to invest abundant resources, emotional and material, into children. The Shepard-Hughes article is an example of this, and a particularly tragic one. She describes a situation in which it is dangerous for mothers to love certain children, given their deep poverty and little access to health care. Thus, these mothers practice passive infanticide. They essentially let their child die by withdrawing care. As she notes, this is made possible not just by economic desperation, but also the cultural context, in which the Catholic Church, which is very powerful in the area, essentially legitimizes this practice in religious terms. Moreover, Shepard-Hughes points out that the responsibility for this is not borne just by these women and the church, but by Brazil's political and economic institutions, which have permitted extreme poverty to persist despite the country's relative economic success. That's a brief sketch of how descent works as a way of establishing kinship. Now let's turn to how marriage makes kin. Marriage creates affinal kinship, that is, kinship among people who are not biologically related. It often functions to create alliances between groups and people, and to preserve and distribute property and resources. We typically think of marriage as based on romantic love, but this is a relatively new and culturally specific idea, and one that might hide other, less obvious ways in which marriage works in our own society. Crucially, marriage meets all these functions by being flexible and often variable. As we shall see, most cultures have multiple forms of marriage, and this variety allows marriage to do important things for people. There are a number of different types of marriage. Prescriptive marriage means that you must marry a certain category of person. Among people in the Amazon, there's something called cross-cousin marriage, where you have to marry a certain cousin. There's arranged marriage, where you must marry a person your family chooses for you, and so on. More common is preferential marriage, where you can marry who you want within certain limits. So, for instance, there's a so-called incest taboo, which sets certain people off limits for marrying, having sexual relationships with, and having children with. Typically, these are close relatives, like siblings, but where the line is drawn differs across cultures. In some places, you can marry your first cousin, in some places, you cannot. There are other limits here. For instance, if a culture practices endogamy, you have to marry within a certain group. If it practices exogamy, you must marry outside of a certain group. There's also the issue of how many people you can marry at once. Monogamy is the form of marriage in which you can marry one person at a time. Polygamy is a form of marriage in which you can marry more than one person at a time. This comes in two varieties: polyandry, a woman can have more than one husband, and polygyny, a man can have more than one wife. Crucially, all these permutations of marriage are intimately linked with the political and economic system, and typically, even in our own society, have political and economic functions. For example, polygyny is often practiced in pastoralist societies, that is, societies based on the herding of animals. In these kinds of societies, older men tend to own most of the livestock and thus can support large households with multiple wives. Younger men tend to do most of the labor, and it's more difficult for them to support large households. Thus, older men have many wives, younger men do not. This frees up younger men to work with the knowledge that as time goes on, they will be able to accumulate many livestock and thus be able to have many wives in the future. The McCurdy article also demonstrates the political and economic functions of marriage. It discusses groups in India that practice arranged marriage that is often used to create economic alliances between clans. There are a whole series of rituals and practices that help cement this. The groom's family must pay a bride price, for instance, to compensate the bride's family for the loss of the labor she can provide. There are wedding rituals, mutual hospitality, exchanges of gifts, all of which help cement these alliances that are formed through marriage. Note that we too construct alliances and preserve resources of various types through marriages, though in a more diffuse and individualistic way than we've seen in other societies. For example, the anthropologist Ken Guest argues that in the US we practice class and race endogamy, meaning we typically marry within our class and racial group. But note that this varies across races, with white people being more likely to practice racial endogamy than people of other races. Only about 7% of white people marry outside their race, but much greater percentages of Black people, Asians, and Native people do. One way to interpret this is that this works across society to preserve the privileged access to resources that white people in general have had in our society by keeping those resources within that racial group by certain patterns of marriage. But this works in terms of class and status too. The vast majority of people in our society tend to marry people of similar class backgrounds, whether measured by income or educational status. Indeed, this has become more the case over the past several decades, which not coincidentally have been a time of increasing class inequality in the United States. We can see this in concentrated form in the rise of celebrity marriages. We see here Jay-Z and Beyonce, and Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. We can also see how marriage functions to preserve status and wealth if we look at children or their spouses moving into parents' businesses. The Trumps are an example of this, as are Patrick and Pat Mahomes, and many other cases where both parent and child are pro athletes. Typically, there are many forms of marriage present in one society. The flexibility this provides can be important. An example is Goldstein's discussion of Tibetan fraternal polyandry. It is a choice, one that allows for the preservation of landholding, which is very important in this society where land is limited. It preserves access to a good life via the inheritance of property. Note that the people in these marriages are aware of tensions that this might create between brothers and so on, just as we are aware of tensions inherent in monogamous marriage. That said, the issue of sexual jealousy, which students often flag as a major problem in this form of marriage, is not really an issue here. This kind of marriage is a norm, and Tibetans accept it and all that comes along with it. This also shows how emotions are culturally specific. What causes anger or jealousy in one culture might not in another, and vice versa. Tibetan fraternal polyandry is very much in decline because of economic and political changes. One change has been that the government, which wants to develop the tourist trade, fears that tourists might view this as backwards, and so it has discouraged or even outlawed the practice. Another change has been the rise of the tourist economy, which has made farming a less attractive option, and as farming has declined, so has this form of marriage. So we can see here how kinship arrangements are linked to economic and political factors and tend to change as economic and political situations shift over time. One famous example of a society with multiple forms of marriage is the Nuer. The Nuer, like the Maasai, are cattle pastoralists in East Africa. Cattle is their key form of wealth, and they value cattle above almost anything else. Crucially, marriage creates rights to cattle, as well as to women and to children on the part of men. It's an agreement between families of the bride and the groom. This involves a complex negotiation of bride wealth, cattle, which are paid to various members of a bride's family. Thus, paternity is crucial here, as it creates claims on cattle that can be used for bride wealth. Keeping these paternal links is crucially important, as it allows cattle to be passed down and redistributed, which is very important for the survival of this society. So, a key question for the Nuer is how to keep links between generations whole so cattle can flow across generations. There are a number of ways in which kinship and marriage in particular meet this function. One involves the separation of the genitor and pater roles in fatherhood. Fatherhood has two aspects. One is biological, so the genitor is the biological father. Another aspect of fatherhood is cultural. This gives us the pater role. This is the culturally legitimate legal or sociological father. We probably all know people who have father figures, stepfathers, uncles, or whoever, who fulfill this pater role, even as they do not fill the genitor role. For the newer, in the case of death, divorce, adultery, or the inability to bear children, the ability to map these categories of fatherhood onto people in different ways in order to preserve paternity and links through the generations through which cattle can flow is very important. And to meet this need, the newer have developed a great variety of forms of marriage. This diagram from a textbook by John Bodley shows no less than 10 forms of marriage that the newer typically practice. I'll go through a couple of them so you can see how this works. First, there's something called ghost marriage. Here the husband dies, but his wife still wants to have children that will be part of his lineage. The dead husband becomes the ghost pater. That is to say, even in death, he fulfills the role of a father. But the woman has children by another man, the genitor. The role of the genitor is merely biological, to provide children. Thus, the wife can have children that will remain part of her dead husband's family. The rights to those children and to cattle and so on remain with the lineage of the dead husband, not with the genitor. So this allows kinship to deal with the fact of early death. Here, an older infertile widow takes on the pater role, that is to say, the culturally legitimate father role. A younger fertile woman comes to work for the older woman, as does a younger man. They form a three-person household. The younger people have children, but the younger man is only serving in the role of genitor. The older widow essentially functions in the role of father or patriarch and has rights to the children and the cattle that come with them. So this provides children for a lineage when a couple cannot procreate. So, in newer society, these various forms of marriage are used to keep cultural relations of paternity intact, even when biological links are broken by death, divorce, lack of attraction, and so on. This is important given the role of cattle in newer society. Distributing cattle through these links allows for them to be distributed through a groom's family. This distribution is key to maintaining a relatively equitable distribution of cattle, which is important because the newer have relatively low levels of technology and are mobile, which makes it difficult if one person owns too many cattle. Being able to spread the burden of the labor involved with raising cattle is very important, and all these forms of marriage help that happen. Different forms of marriage often reflect broader cultural, political, and economic factors rather than the other way around. This makes sense if we see kinship as a way of establishing claims on loyalty and resources. Marriage does so, but it works in a certain context where resources are distributed and produced in certain ways. This leads us to the issue of same-sex marriage. Back in 2004, when this was a far more contentious issue than it is today, the American Anthropological Association issued a statement on marriage rejecting the idea that marriage is necessarily between one man and one woman in healthy and thriving societies. This was a factual matter. There are, in fact, societies that have flourished, as anthropologists have shown, where marriage is not only between one man and one woman. We've seen lots of examples of this today. So while one is free to argue that it's one's preference or belief that marriage should be between one man and one woman, one cannot rely on the anthropological record to back this up. This is an example of how anthropological research can inform a real-world political debate. In the time since the American Anthropological Association issued this statement, Same-sex marriage has become common and widely accepted in the U.S. There are still those who object to it, however, including several members of the current Supreme Court. So it's possible that this will become an issue again. If so, anthropologists will be ready to publicize what we know about marriage and kinship. That successful and healthy societies typically have flexible and variable forms of kinship that allow for a broader array of people, not just LGBTQ people, but newer widows, Tibetan farmers, and so on, to access the things that their culture finds valuable and meaningful. Okay, this brings to a close our first lecture on kinship. Next time, we'll talk about fictive kinship and some contemporary aspects of kinship in our society. Thanks for your attention, and I'll see you next time.